Yeah, October 17th. This is, I guess, technically my first video, um, on this little homegrown kit of technology. I have just using my iPhone and a little sound speaker that plugs into it. So hopefully the sound's good for everyone. Um, I guess what I wanted to start with, a lot of these videos are actually for those of you that are in the integrative herbalism program, the apprenticeship program. And I like writing, I love words, but I do find that there's a certain spirit that's shared in audio and video that's a little more direct. And it's also I find when I'm writing, I get into a really heady space, which is okay, but it's a little trickier to stay in that hearty space, which I really feel is kind of a big part of my work and a big part of a lot of our work in this information age of just endless thoughts crashing, and processing verbal information and written information. So I like to consider herbalism a little bit more of a living tradition. And in this sense, an oral tradition. So what is integrative herbalism? I mean, I know a lot of us are passionate about the healing of the planet, the healing of our ancestral lineages, the healing of ourselves, our bodies, the collective. Integrative it's an interesting word. I notice it's being used in, modern medical settings, integrative medicine. I've been invited out to speak at local medical institutions as an herbalist and as part of their integrative medicine, programming content. And, they're doing their best to try to integrate true holistic concepts into a paradigm that's really mechanistic and reductionist based science. I just wanted to touch on the foundations of the concept of integrative in my perspective. When I first started studying herbalism back in the early 90s, the holistic was the word that everybody was into. Holistic being, a few different things. Holistic means inclusive, rather than segmented into parts. Is my liver separate from my emotions of resentment? Is my fear separate from my bladder issues? Is my mental health is separate from my diet? Like that really basic stuff. That's one perspective of holistic. Another is perceiving, this is really crucial, perceiving ourselves and each other as vessels for souls or consciousness. So within this vehicle of my body, I'm actually a spark. There's a spark coming out through my eyes and through my being that will travel on afterwards and actually came from somewhere into this vessel, this body, to learn certain lessons and to participate in the great unfolding. In that sense, holistic healing is, mind, body, and soul. It's got a spiritual component to it. We're not just a bunch of parts that randomly mutated and created this incredible ability to have consciousness and, manipulate our environments and question our origins and all that kind of stuff. So holistic also, it's interesting. It's kind of based on this idea, and this is where it gets, I guess, more metaphysical, not just physical, is that DNA is, in a way, channeling information, much like a crystal would channel information in a cell phone. But it is coded. So if you could imagine energy coming in through the coating and releasing like a hologram almost. And the hologram is a reflection of the soul and the mind and the higher self in the best of its ability. That there are apparent flaws or translation issues, lost in translation, which to me is part of the great perfection, actually. It's not just, something has fallen from grace, so to speak, and it's flawed. It's just flawed, and that's the end of it. I think in holistic perspective, life is a journey of remembering and healing and using all of the opportunities that we have in our relationships, in our own personal crisis, what brings us joy, our creative urges, all these different things. They're actually part of our process of remembering. And yes, within the DNA, there is trauma. There is trauma we're healing from the wars, from the raids, from the loss of connection to earth, to source. So when I was about 19, I had grown up kind of in a typical sort of Gaelic, Irish, North American setting. Hardworking people, love nature, love their drinks, their alcohol, love their good meat. They love their, playing cards together and just living that sort of that life of the 70s and 80s. And, I saw a lot of suffering that I couldn't control. I was raised by a single mom, and, the men that she had in her life were not very healthy. They certainly weren't what she deserved. I feel like she's a beautiful soul, but like the rest of us, we're often growing into our sense of self-worth. And, suffering is, like I said, with trauma that we're carrying, it likes to repeat itself. There's a charge to it that likes to cycle. So I saw a lot of this suffering, and I felt pretty helpless to it. And I could only do so much. But it did leave me as a young adult craving healing, And I knew I felt good in nature, so I'd walk along this river actually. And I lived the party life of a young man, and I grew up like on hard rock and heavy metal and all that kind of stuff, but I really felt called towards native spirituality. I didn't know why. I had seen some films, and certainly Dances with Wolves came out back in those days. It really triggered some white guilt in me, but also I felt the pain of the loss of what I watched the indigenous people losing. And I went and volunteered in the inner city, and I met an elder there, and I wish I could remember his name, but I think it was at the Indian Family Center on Selkirk here in Winnipeg. And I asked him, like, how can I help, your people? I just felt like I wanted to participate. And he said, if you want to help my people, you have to discover what your own ancestors have lost. So that was a real paradigm shift for me. What had my ancestors had lost? I really didn't even consider that. I thought like the white folks came across the ocean and took over the lands and destroyed this native way of life, but I hadn't actually considered that there was a loss in European culture. And of course, I went on from there to discover that there was a loss of European culture, and that there was colonization started over there. So the more research I did into my own Gaelic ancestry, the more I realized, the languages were banned, gathering at streams and sacred places were banned. A lot of the sacred ceremonies that had taken place to keep us, it wasn't just magic, juju, childish stuff. It was attempting to keep us in good relationship with the elements, with nature, with source. And, a lot of that was banned as new paradigms of religion were coming across Europe. The people that represented the old ways, let's say the ways that were actually even pre-agriculture and we have to remember the Ice Age ended about 14,000 years ago. We had a hunter-gatherer shamanic society, or cultures, scattered around. As things actually warmed up and the glaciers melted, agriculture could begin. Certainly people could settle down more and grow crops. And what followed that actually was quite a patriarchal structure of, there was like hierarchy between the sun, which brought the warmth, which brought the crops, which brought good yields, which made everybody happy and make wine and, all these other things. And so the sort of lord of the land was considered next in line to God as far as hierarchy went. Which, if done in a healthy way, could be not much different than a beehive, which functions off of, queen bees and worker bees. There's harmony that can happen. Unfortunately, power corrupts, especially as we know in, religion or even corporations and the studies that have been done on masculine hormones and psychology. As power increases, so does the potential for decay or corruption. A lot of the hormones start to really kick in, a lot of high testosterone, which doesn't leave us often making the best decisions. But also those that represented the old ways, the sort of pre-agricultural ways of relationship with the land rather than control and hierarchy and that sort of thing, they were almost a threat to the paradigm. And a lot of those types of leaders were also feminine. They were not just masculine. There were a lot of female healers and wise women, I guess we would say, tenders to life, people who kept life, brought in babies, tended the medicines, and helped people stay well, So if you look into the traditions, you'll see that, there was one of the most mass-published books was the Malleus Maleficarum, which was basically the witch's hammer, it's referred to, which was kind of a joint venture, I understand, between Pope Innocent VIII and King Henry or somebody like that. And it really was how to identify a witch and what to do with her, which is really atrocious. I almost don't recommend you look into it. But if you want to understand what happened and what we're healing from right now, actually, you have to understand this tussle that went on between the masculine and the feminine, but also the sky god, sun god religions and the sort of lunar feminine traditions. It's not like, I want to not get stuck into gender battles, because I feel like we're really coming to a place of balance, which doesn't really happen through hatred and blame and accusations, but more through a heartfelt acknowledgement maybe of where things went wrong and what's required now. So I can only get so much into this today, but I will say that in the apprenticeship program, as well as the classes that I've run and retreats, it's mostly women showing up. And I think it's because the feminine has a natural interest in ecology and tending life, whereas the masculine tends to crave, power and control to a certain degree. It's very competitive, I'm not saying females aren't competitive, but, the alpha male thing does exist. We're very competitive creatures, but also we're interested in transcending, getting out of here. So a lot of the male-centric spiritual traditions actually seem to be we shouldn't be here, this place sucks, let's transcend it and get out of here, which is obviously plays out on the stage. So integrative herbalism is trying to say, like, how do we embrace our worldly experience, learn from it, work with all kinds of traditions around the world, but heal this wound of separation between not just our relationship to the planet, but realizing the relationship between the mind and nature is actually wounded. Reductionism, sort of the science that followed the religion of agriculture and so on, led to science, and science is amazing, and I do totally believe there's a place for Western medical capacities, 100%. Like, we'll get more into that, but reductionism slowly cut nature down into pieces and parts and took the animism out of it. So animism is an important word. It's like the spirit that flows through all things, the intelligence that's happening throughout all of nature, of which we're a part and that we can naturally connect to, that requires no hierarchy. It might require meditation, nature retreats, a lot of the temples, like the temples of Asclepius in the ancient times, people would go there and pray for healing and eat healing diets, and they would sleep and wait for a dream to guide them on what they need to do to change their well-being or their situation, because they were not separate from all the intelligence of nature. See, so there was no box separating the human being from source and from earth. So a lot of the suffering that we're seeing right now is because we're so heavily reductionist, that we're seeing people having tons of separation anxiety. There's never maybe been a lonelier time on earth, even though there's so many of us. We're living such individuated little separate little boxed lives, and that's causing a lot of aloneness, a lot of pain, a lot of extra burden on everybody. And if you notice, a lot of the traditions and bloodlines are merging. So even though we're merging, we're also trying to say, like, this is my tradition, this is who I am, and keep this sense of sovereignty. And I get it, we want to honor our traditions, but what's happening is all the plants are merging. Like, the plants that surround me here are a blend of pioneer plants and native plants that were here before colonization and pioneers arrived. So there's an integration of worldly traditions. So we'll be covering a lot of Ayurveda, which a lot of you have studied already, the ancient science of healing out of India, because as I looked for my Gaelic roots, I couldn't find much there, actually. A lot of Reconstructionist Celtic stuff, a lot of Wiccan stuff, which I didn't super connect with. As far as like the deep healing goes, I found that Ayurveda actually was like a hotbed of almost like a holistic, comprehensive healing system that went into India, as apparently, though that's debated where Ayurveda came from and where the Vedas came from, but it's at least 5,000-year-old tradition of working with the elements, which is like true in all of our traditions, from traditional Chinese medicine, early European humor systems, Native American medicine wheel, South American, like, that is the way our ancestors work, because we are made of water, earth, we are made of light, fire, energy, metabolism, intelligence, bacteria, minerals. Working with the elements has always been foundational. So, but what's happening is kind of a merging of that with nutraceutical research into what are the properties in curcumin or turmeric that are doing these amazing things, and what is histamine? How does a lack of the gene that breaks down histamine, affect us? Especially important as everyone's getting more into fermentations, which can raise histamine and cause issues for people, right? So So we've got this modern science thing happening, but we're also seeing like Ayurveda, which is actually quite connected. Sanskrit and Gaelic and Indo-European tribal peoples across Europe were quite interwoven in a lot of ways, you know. But Ayurveda also has a lot of goddess awareness of the livingness of creation. You know, the rivers are named after goddess. Same if you go to Ireland, you know, then the rivers were named after goddesses. And, you know, in Scotland, for example, the clan system was very similar to the clan systems of the Haida on the West Coast. It was matriarchal because you knew who owned the land based on the lineages of the mother. You didn't always know who your father was, but you knew who your mother was. And that's how land was distributed, which is another sort of political look at what took place over the last agricultural era. So a lot to cover as far as like nutraceuticals go. Our ancestors worked with astrology. They understood the planets are not just the moon and the sun are influencing, everything's influencing us. It's all one thing. So much for us to discuss, but let's just say that integrative herbalism is truly that. It's integrative. The feminine and the masculine, the yin and the yang, all different cultures together, kind of like the local Cree prophecy of the coming of the rainbow warriors, which is just all nations coming together out of a love for the planet and each other and spirit or source. But also realizing like this medicine land here that's all around us that we have to heal our relationship with, not just exploit and take from. It's made up of plants that are from many different cultures. And in my medicine shop, in the holistic center, all kinds of cultures coming in. I've got Ukrainians, East Indians, people from Trinidad, people from South America, Colombia, you know, coming from Asia, coming from European traditions. Like, it's amazing. And that's kind of what's happening. These plants don't care what my genes are. Like, these plants heal me as a human being. And that way they're kind of more evolved than us because they don't see separation. That's really a colonizing thing, you know, of the mind, us and them. Divide and conquer. So you'll see a lot of people maybe sometimes saying, like, these are our medicines. You don't use this medicine. And that's not my way personally. I feel like the way I've been taught by spirit, by my elders that I've worked with, indigenous elders, elders from Peru, elders from the Tibetan traditions, because Tibetan Buddhism is a huge part of my life, has been a huge part of my life. You know, when you're in ceremony and you're in those really sacred spaces, you realize it's all about the human family. And that the suffering is a lot about power struggles and resentments and not forgiving, not moving on, not humbling ourselves, and so on. So we're working with, you know, states of being as vibrations. Health is a state. Yes, we're working with nutrition. You know, we're going to be working with that. We can talk about astrology. You know, we can talk about relationship. We can talk about yin and yang. How active are we versus how much do we rest? You know, it's vast. So today's just a little warm-up here beside the Red River. I'm going to see how the sound turned out. And I hope you enjoyed this little video. And, you know, there's more to come. And thank you for listening. And keep up your studies. And, yeah, I'll post some more videos soon. Bye for now.